Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
So the idea of democratic planning, as I said before, was that Indian planning is different from communist planning. It is a mixture of idealism about this new democracy and about how this democracy really comes into substance only when there's popular participation in it. But I think another aspect of democratic planning and the reason that the Indian state is reaching out to its citizens to participate in the plan is that there is a realism about limited state capacity. India realizes that the state capacity that it has is such that unless people make unbidden sort of voluntary contributions towards the plan, save in the way that the Indian state wants to, save in the kinds of bonds that it wants to, help with village projects of road building, dispensary building, all kinds of other things, that the plans really couldn't succeed. So it's a combination of this idealism about democracy and what it meant to be a young democracy with participation from citizens, but also a cold realism about state capacity as well.
India's 5-year plans were one of the developing world's most ambitious experiments. After nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule, planning the economy was meant to be independent India's route from poverty to prosperity. Planning democracy explores how India married liberal democracy to a socialist economy. Planning not only built India's data systems, it even shaped the nature of its democracy. In this episode of BIC Talks, author and assistant professor of history, University of Notre, Nikhil Menon, and economist and financial journalist Niranjan Rajadhyaksha discuss how India walked a tightrope between capitalism and communism and worked on the project of nation building in the aftermath of empire. In this compelling history, Nikhil Menon brings the world of planning to life through the intriguing story of a gifted scientist known as the Professor, a trailblazing research institute in Calcutta, and the alluring idea of democratic planning. Planning democracy recasts our understanding of the Indian Republic, uncovering how planning came to define the nation and revealing the ways in which it continues to shape our world today. And now, over to Niranjan.
Thanks a lot, Lekha. And Nikhil, it's a real pleasure to chat with you about your book on Indian planning. So welcome to this podcast.
Thank you, Niranjan. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for reading the book and having this conversation with me.
Yeah. If I can start at the very beginning, so to say, with the title of the book. I was quite fascinated with the title because you call it Planning Democracy rather than Planning Economic Development. And usually we talk about planning, all the debates on planning are in the context of economic strategy. And you say somewhere in the introduction to your book that planning was a means of nation building in the aftermath of empire. So why do you take this route to examine the Indian planning experience?
Thanks, Niranjan. The title of the book is something that I spent a lot of time mulling over. And the reason that it's titled Planning Democracy and not Planning Economic Development is because the book argues that planning needs to be seen in a way that's more capacious than that of just economic policy. In my research, I found that planning was freighted with all kinds of other lofty expectations. So in terms of the economy, as you know well, it was viewed as what independent India could finally do now that it was, free from the shackles of colonialism, which was associated with capitalism in the minds of most nationalists. In terms of politics, Nehru and the Congress Party were animated by the idea of democratic planning, which is a concept that I explore in the book. The idea of democratic planning was that through planning in a democracy, India was effectively arranging a marriage between Western-style liberal democracy and a Soviet-inspired socialist planning. That too, when the Cold War was effectively pitting them as incompatible. So as Congress leaders would sort of keep on repeating, what marked Indian democratic planning as different from Soviet planning was that here citizens were free to disagree and vote the government out. So with planning, the early independent Indian state is not just marking out territory in terms of economic policy, but they're also trying to claim that they're forging a new path on this global stage. So you have non-alignment in foreign relations and planning democracy at home. In fact, when taken to its extreme in sort of Nehruvian rhetorical excess, you see that planning was even expected to have this social aspect. It was seen as the work of development that could smoothen differences of caste and religion, and it was meant to represent this kind of common national endeavor. And so really planning became something of an obsession in 1950s India. And I think that we wouldn't get a sense of why India became obsessed with planning if you just looked at it as purely bloodless economic policy.
Yeah, thanks, Nikhil. In fact, that's the sense I got. In fact, it's a revelation to me that, as an economist, I've always been taught or looked at Indian planning in terms of the planning models, in terms of, the implications for economic growth. And I think in a way, this book opens up an entire new debate or an entire new way of looking at planning. So just sticking with the idea or the title of the book, the subtitle says how a professor, an institute, and an idea shaped India. Now, the professor obviously is P.C. Mahalanobis, who is in a way the protagonist of this story, wonderful story you've told. And the institute is the Indian Statistical Institute. So about Mahalanobis, obviously he was a man of towering achievements and his contribution to the Indian statistical system is quite outstanding. And you say somewhere, in fact, you cite C.R. Rao, who was another great sort of giant of Indian statistics, as saying that Mahalanobis was a physicist by training, a statistician by instinct, and a planner by conviction. Can you unpack this for us? Because it's very interesting to understand Mahalanobis while you understand the broader Indian planning story.
Absolutely. I think that Mahalanobis is this figure that we as Indians really ought to know more about. I myself, encountered, like most people, the name when you study the second five-year plan and, your 11th standard or 12th standard economics. But that's basically where you encounter him. And then he sort of drifts away into the ether of obscurity. Mahalanobis was quite simply one of the most influential Indians of his generation. He was born in the late 1800s in Bengal. He grew up in this culturally refined household, trained as a physicist, first at Presidency College in Calcutta, and then at Cambridge University. In terms of his personality, Mahalanobis was brilliant by all accounts, was charismatic, was also serious according to his friends, and enormously self-assured. He's also a man of sort of several talents. As we alluded to, he was a physicist, but also then became India's leading statistician. He was well versed in ancient Sanskrit texts. He was quite an expert on Bengali poetry as a companion and friend of Rabindranath Tagore, and was even a dabbler in architecture. Though, if you believe the people at ISI at the time, he was not very good at it, but was not one open to taking criticism on that matter. But Mahalanobis was someone who was quite animated by a sense of purpose. I mean, he wanted his academic work to matter for the nation. This is something that comes up repeatedly in his private correspondence. And his interest in statistics begins quite by accident. And for a few decades, he wears two hats, really, as a lecturer of physics when he comes back to Presidency College from Cambridge University. But then almost as a sort of side hustle, he becomes India's leading statistician. And over the 1930s and 40s, he becomes a global pioneer in the use of large-scale sample surveys, which he conducts at the Indian Statistical Institute, which he was the founder and patron of from the early 1930s. By the time independence comes around in 1947, Mahalanobis is already a nationally celebrated figure for his contributions to sample surveys. And in the scientific community, he's already a fellow of the Royal Society. And he comes to be known increasingly across the world as a pioneer of large-scale sample surveys. But it is after independence, really, that he becomes a nationally significant figure because India, of course, sets up this vast architecture of data, the Central Statistical Organization, the National Sample Survey, national income accounts, India's early GDP calculations. Mahalanobis is at the center of all these things. And of course, Mahalanobis is also the person who brings India its first two digital computers to Calcutta, a story that I think is often overlooked or forgotten in Indian history. And then eventually becomes the author of the second five-year plan, which, as you know very well, Niranjan, broadly lays out the template for Indian economic policy till about liberalization in the 1990s. So all in all, a very, very important figure.
While obviously recognizing his towering intellectual contributions and also his general brilliance, you also don't sort of pull any punches. He does come across as a slightly overbearing person. And at one point, I think you even mentioned that he almost operates outside the institutional structure of the Indian state. I was surprised to read in your book that he didn't become a full member of the Planning Commission till 1960. And, the ISI, they were at that point, the hub of ISI was Calcutta. So in a way, while this entire thing was about planning and democracy, in a way, Mahalanobis was sitting outside the structure and like had an oversized personal influence on the course of planning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in terms of his personality traits, Mahalanobis comes across as someone who is, as you say, quite accurately, as overbearing, arrogant even. He's someone who is extremely self-assured. People on ISI's campus, while they admire him greatly, also chafe against the fact that he runs ISI almost as a one-man show. I mean, of course, he is the most important academic there. He is responsible for so much of its success. He is an institution builder, but also there's always a threat around the corner of this institution overshadowing, of this individual overshadowing the institution. I include anecdotes in the book about economists, some of whom are sympathetic to Mahalanobis, but some of whom are not sympathetic to Mahalanobis, both of whom agree that he is a brilliant man, but can be very difficult to handle. I talk about H.W. Arndt, who is a free market economist who goes on this sort of long car ride with Mahalanobis from Rambagh Palace in Jaipur to Agra, and says that the entire journey was basically, not a conversation, but a harangue by Mahalanobis against capitalism and against the United States. And Arndt says that this is a person who's very sure about who should be planned for and who should be planning it. And I think that gives you a sense of the kind of person that Mahalanobis was. And you are right to point out that more structurally, Mahalanobis occupies this quite interesting position, which is why he made enemies, not just in organizations outside the Planning Commission, but maybe we'll discuss this later, but even within the Planning Commission, there were people who really disliked the rise of this virtual outsider to becoming the most powerful person within the Planning Commission. And the reason, as you point out, that Mahalanobis, despite being perhaps most influential in the late 1950s, does not become a formal member of the Planning Commission until 1960, is because though he was offered the job, he turns it down. And the reason Mahalanobis turns it down is because he realizes that if he becomes a formal member of the Planning Commission, he's then tied down by all the expectations that an employee of the government is. And he wants to maintain his independence as a scientist. He wants to maintain his independence as an administrator of the Indian Statistical Institute. And he also wants to retain the ability to speak his mind, all of which he realizes will be constrained and that his wings would be clipped if he became a formal member of the Planning Commission. And so he prefers to, as you suggest, operate outside these sort of strictures of the government silos. And so he comes in as an advisor, but makes the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta almost a sort of parallel organization that is helping with planning.
So, Nikhil, since you mentioned the anecdote, and your book has some really, really interesting and telling anecdotes. And, one of the things I really liked about your book are these flashes of wit, which come through. So just when you're building up, there are a couple of lines which make you break out into a smile. One point you make is about how Mahalanobis used to meet a lot of foreign economists, and he obviously sought their support. And you say somewhere that this person who was the master of random sampling didn't see that he was actually dealing with a biased sample, because most of the foreign economists he met were already, in support of planning. So, I really think just as a reader, some of these little asides, these like witty, remarks really enliven the book. But I want to come back to this issue of the economists. It seems that Mahalanobis thought, while he sought support of international economists, and we've read in even other histories of that era of, people like Kaleski, Joan Robinson, Galbraith, a lot of the top economists in the world coming to Calcutta to sort of work on Indian planning. He didn't have much of a high regard for Indian economists, it looks like. And while the two main critiques, which is one was by Shenoy and one was by Brahmanand Vakil, are well known, I think I get a sense that Mahalanobis perhaps didn't necessarily think very highly of Indian economists. Would it be correct to say that?
I actually broaden it further to say that in some ways, Mahalanobis had a low opinion of economists in general. And that when he's quoting these economists abroad, that he's doing it more in a tactical way in order to neutralize domestic critics, rather than because he has a high opinion of economics as a profession. Now, we must remember that in the early 1950s, economics as a profession is yet to mature, and it certainly does not have the kind of popular acclaim and legitimacy and centrality to policy making that it has today. Right? So this is 1950s is really just the beginning of development economics and its maturation as a profession. And as people around Mahalanobis note, he was distrustful of economists and sometimes even resentful of them. And I think that there were two reasons for this. One is that this is a man who is quite, as I said, self-sure about his abilities, but economics is an area of expertise in which he has absolutely no training, right? He has only training as a physicist, and he's a sort of self-taught statistician. And as Mahalanobis writes in a letter back to Calcutta from New York in a quite uncharacteristically vulnerable manner, he writes to his friend Pitambar Pant at the ISI that he's, quote, quite ignorant about academic economics, and that he actually feels an inferiority complex about it. And so I think that it's this inferiority complex that manifests in outward dismissal of them. Another possible reason for this kind of frosty relationship with economists was that Mahalanobis was essentially a scientist, a physicist, and he believed in arriving at black and white, value-neutral answers. And I think that an insight into Mahalanobis's way of thinking about this was actually provided by Milton Friedman, the celebrated free market economist, who the professor meets Mahalanobis in 1955. And it's a brief meeting, but Milton Friedman has quite an insightful passage in his memoirs about what makes Mahalanobis tick. He says that he has met people like Mahalanobis before. He says this is a very bright and brilliant man, but that Mahalanobis is essentially a mathematically gifted person. And that people who are mathematically gifted arrive at a certitude at very young age about expecting clean, value-neutral answers and believe in their ability to arrive at these answers. And then Milton Friedman quotes Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations to say that people like Mahalanobis believe that they are chess players in the chessboard of humanity, where they can move each piece on the chessboard. Whereas actually economics teaches you that nobody has that kind of control over the chessboard of humanity. So I thought that was a very interesting insight from somebody who is a critic of Mahalanobis's policies. And in fact, there's like another aside about Mahalanobis and Milton Friedman, people who would be on the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of economic policy. Mahalanobis had actually asked the US government to send some advisor on economics, and they had proposed the name of Milton Friedman, and this was in the early 1950s. Mahalanobis happened to be in Geneva, where he met John Kenneth Galbraith, and mentioned to Galbraith that, this is the person that your government has recommended. And Galbraith jokingly says to Mahalanobis that having Milton Friedman advise on economic planning is like having the Pope advise on family planning. And so Mahalanobis changes his mind and then invites John Kenneth Galbraith instead. In terms of the question about the specific critics of the Mahalanobis model, like Shenoy, Vakil, and Brahmananda, the so-called Bombay School economists, Brahmananda talks about how unpopular the wage goods model or being ex-positivists were at that time. Brahmananda talks about how being critical of the plan was almost being seen as being anti-nationalist. Some would even accuse you of being a CIA agent. But interestingly for me, Brahmananda, when in his interview, does not extend that ill will towards Mahalanobis himself, who he actually describes as a, quote, brilliant man with fresh ideas. And in fact, Mahalanobis asked Brahmananda to sort of share his views on some subjects. But I think it's important to see why the Mahalanobis model wins out. And I think partly it's because he quotes this foreign opinion that is already biased towards his views. But it is also because domestic economists at the time, mostly outside of the Bombay School, agreed with the broad ideas of the Mahalanobis plan. So in the heyday of Delhi School of Economics, V.K.R.V. Rao, K.N. Raj, Sukumai Chakravarti, Amartya Sen, and even Jagdish Bhagwati were all sort of said to be sort of euphoric about this plan frame. And as I think it was best put by a critic of economic planning, Peter Bauer, who was a sort of lifelong opponent of protectionism and state planning. And he says that the Mahalanobis plan frame sort of largely reflected the dominant opinion of development economists in the West at the time as well. And he says this, of course, with great regret. He says that he thinks it's wrong that they do this, but it gives you a sense of how the criticisms of the plan were at that point, even within the mainstream of the economics profession, seen as marginal. And that would change over the course of the next 2-3 decades when even one-time supporters like Jagdish Bhagwati and Manmohan Singh would become critical of the import substitution aspects of planning.
Actually, Nikhil, it's very nice to hear you say all these things, because I'm a product of the Bombay School, and in fact, Brahmanand was my teacher. So,
oh wow, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, I completely endorse what you said. That he was respectful of Mahalanobis, but critical of his approach to planning. And it's interesting. Also, another name which came up was Pitambar Pant, who in a way was Mahalanobis's right hand man, and who worked on this great perspective plans. And Pitambar Pant also was a physicist by training. And the other person who Mahalanobis got a lot of support from, another brilliant man, C.D. Deshmukh, he was a botanist by training. So actually, it's interesting that in the heyday of Indian planning, or the high noon, there were very few economists on the planning commission as full members. I think V.K.R.V. Rao sometime in the mid-60s becomes the first one. So it's always interesting. But since, obviously Mahalanobis is the protagonist, but we can't think of Indian planning without the other name, right? Nehru. And obviously, it was part of Nehru's political vision for independent India that planning would be central to it. But I think that's well known. I think what you bring out in your book very, very evocatively is that Nehru very early on also understood the importance of Mahalanobis was doing in terms of building a statistical base, and I think I've written in my review of your book that basically you can't plan for something unless you count it. How do you set those numerical targets if you don't have the numbers? If you could speak a bit, not on Nehru as a planner, but Nehru's early understanding of the importance of statistics. And it sort of goes back to some of the early Indian nationalists as well, Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, who also were very, very particular about getting their numbers right. So just a little, if you could speak a bit about Nehru and how he was ahead of the curve in recognizing the importance of statistics.
Yes, sure. I mean, Nehru, as we all know, casts a very long shadow on independent India. And when you can decide, it's each to their own about whether they think that shadow was beneficial or was detrimental to independent India. But Nehru's role was absolutely critical to the prestige that planning enjoyed and how central it became to the story of independent India. Just very briefly, Nehru was actually asked to chair the National Planning Committee in 1938 by none other than Subhash Chandra Bose, when Bose was the president of the Congress Party. And from then on, Nehru's personal interest and belief in the importance of planning became crucial to the power it had. And as Nehru once put it, in independent India, he preferred one technocrat to 4 bureaucrats. And I think that gives you a sense of the kind of wide license and power that technocrats wielded in independent India. In terms of statistics itself, as you point out, the story goes back further than Nehru, though Nehru plays a crucial part. In some ways, the importance of statistics was highlighted by an even earlier generation of nationalists, going back to people like Dadabhai Naoroji, who used statistics in his critique of British colonialism, in his poverty and un-British rule in India, when he talks about the drain theory of wealth, when he talks about colonialism's economic exploitation of India. As another historian, as a sort of very well-known and celebrated historian, C.A. Bailey says that this was a kind of sort of statistical liberalism that people like Naoroji, Rana De, Feroz Shah Mehta, in fact, that many of them used as a way to sort of counter-program against the propaganda of empire. So Nehru himself comes to recognize, as you point out, that if India wanted to have a planned economy, and there was wide agreement across the political aisle that India needed a planned economy. You have Gandhians that want planning. You have the Muslim League that is talking about planning. You have socialists that are talking about planning. The Congress is talking about planning. Even the industrialists, as you well know, endorse their own kind of planning with the Bombay Plan. Lala Shriram, Birla, Tata, they're all on board with some kind of planning. So Nehru in the late 1980s, as the president of the National Planning Committee, he realizes that they need to produce all kinds of reports about the state of different aspects of the Indian economy. And in order to produce those reports, he realizes that people are reporting to him saying, well, we just don't have enough data about the economy. And if you need to plan the economy, you need to know, as you said, what you are counting. And as he said, Indians were basically in the dark when it came to data, and that Indians needed to, in some ways, turn on the lights. And it is around this time precisely that if Nehru was sort of, so to speak, looking around the country, he would have noted that the Indian Statistical Institute and Mahalanobis were making a name for themselves precisely in the field of data gathering. And I talk about a crucial meeting between Nehru and Mahalanobis in the late 1930s at Anand Bhavan, the very plush ancestral mansion of the Nehrus built by Motilal Nehru in Allahabad. And Nehru talks about meeting with Mahalanobis, who he'd met socially a few times before, but this time they were discussing planning and statistics and data. And he talks about staying up past 2 a.m, discussing the role that statistics could play in India's economic development. And I think that from that point onwards, it became clear that instead of the disaggregated, decentralized forms of statistical data gathering that the British engaged in, that India would need to have a centralized organization. And in some ways, it is why in the early 1950s, we set up institutions that last to this day: the Central Statistical Organization, the National Sample Surveys. All of this was set up in this early phase of establishing a data infrastructure.
Thanks, Nikhil. Since, right from the beginning, we've been saying that your book has a wider view of planning. And so the politics of planning also is important. And again, we know some of the personal debates between Nehru and Patel. Even Gandhi's way of thinking about economic development was quite different. Later, Rajaji broke away. But I think your book also throws a lot of light on the tensions between the Planning Commission and the Finance Ministry. And John Mathai resigned actually from the Nehru cabinet the moment the Planning Commission was announced, saying that it undercuts the cabinet system of government. And you keep sort of bringing up this running, I wouldn't say battle, but tension between the Finance Ministry and the Planning Commission. And occasionally, whenever the plans get into trouble, the Finance Ministry tries to regain some power. So could you speak a bit about that as well?
Absolutely. I think that it's important to remember that though planning was so dominant in this period, the question of who would control the levers of power behind the plans was not very well settled. And so the rise of the Planning Commission wasn't without its hiccups. I mean, there was, as you mentioned, a good deal of backstage wrangling between Patel and Nehru and others in the cabinet about what exactly the powers and scope of the Planning Commission should be. In fact, another scholar, Vivek Chibber, has argued that the Planning Commission that did result did not have as much of the enforcement authority that was initially envisioned. But regardless, even the Planning Commission that did result in March 1950 had an enormous amount of power. And so much so that one of India's first finance ministers, John Mathai, as you point out, resigned partly over the extent of the Planning Commission's powers. He was the finance minister, and he believed that the Planning Commission's powers stepped on the toes of the finance ministry. And he has this evocative phrase in which he refers to the Planning Commission as becoming a super cabinet, that the Planning Commission was therefore arrogating to itself powers that should not belong to it. I mean, before coming to a lot of these battles between the Finance Ministry and the Planning Commission, I'd like to point out that even within the Planning Commission, this was a space that was riven with conflict. Mahalanobis was certainly not given a red carpet welcome in the mid-1950s. The powerful deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, V.T. Krishnamachari, and its also very powerful General Secretary Tarlok Singh were both working against Mahalanobis because to them he was just an outsider from Calcutta, and this Calcutta organization was conducting a coup against the Planning Commission in Delhi. Mahalanobis's letters very evocatively talk about how he considers resigning a couple of times because he would go to Delhi and he would hear from others such as C.D. Deshmukh or other acolytes in the Planning Commission about the whispers that were going on behind his back. He believed that V.T. Krishnamachari and Tarlok Singh were trying to sabotage him. And of course, outside of that, there were tough battles between the Planning Commission and the Finance Ministry. And I think you put it well when you say that every time the plan ran into some trouble, the Finance Ministry would try to use that to assert its advantage. So after the resignation of John Mathai, to some extent, a truce held between the Finance Ministry and the Planning Commission. And the reason for that truce was that the Finance Minister was C.D. Deshmukh, who was a longtime friend of Mahalanobis, had been a friend of Mahalanobis from before independence when he was a central banker, and the central bank would decamp to Calcutta during the summer months. And Deshmukh was a sort of house guest of Mahalanobis for, every Sunday when he was there. C.D. Deshmukh was then made president of the Indian Statistical Institute. So he's both the finance minister of the country and the president of the Indian Statistical Institute, and so acts as a bridge between Delhi and Calcutta. But once C.D. Deshmukh is replaced in 1956, and the ambitious second five-year plan has run into problems, power slowly begins to move towards the finance ministry. And then as you have finance ministers like T.T. Krishnamachari and then Morarji Desai, you see that as the plans fail to fulfill their ambitious targets, the finance ministry is able to claw back powers from the planning commission. And then after the death of Nehru, with planning commission deputy chairman like Ashok Mehta and D.R. Gadgil, the powers of the planning commissions are trimmed from inside as well.
You mentioned the role of Mahalanobis and the planning commission in bringing computers to India. And that's another, I think, a very, very fascinating story you tell. And because planning requires computation, and in fact, a lot of the Soviet plans, or even from the input-output models of the old times, they were possible because of computing power. And I think there was a tussle between the planners who wanted access to computing and the atomic program led by Bhabha and the others. So Mahalanobis was very much a visionary. He realized that India needed computers, right?
Yes, this is actually a story that caught me by surprise in the archives. When I came across it, I didn't know very much about it at all. I was quite surprised and just genuinely fascinated. The reason that I started calling up these files in the archives, I was just personally interested in hearing about these computers that were coming to Calcutta, because of course the story that we mostly know is that the first computers are in Bombay with the atomic energy program and Homi Bhabha. But these are computers that are coming before that. And I think that I realized that actually the first two digital computers to come to India, which were amongst the first digital computers in Asia outside Japan, were both to Calcutta at the ISI for the purposes of planning. So just to give you a flavor of the chapter in which I talk about computers for the listeners, the story that I came across at first was the story of this young man named Morton Nadler, who was this young Jewish kid growing up in Brooklyn, who was a communist in the 1930s, and in the 1940s decides that the call to communism is such that he needs to leave the capitalist paradise of the United States and go to a communist country. And so he lies to his parents saying that he's going to do a PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris, goes to Paris, but then goes to Czechoslovakia, which is a part of the Soviet Union at the time, and to work on radar systems. What he does not know is that in doing this, he's considered a defector by the American government. And so the CIA and FBI are both after him and are using one of his parents, his mother, as a kind of mole to give information on him. And so I trace the story of how for a few years he's in Prague, doesn't realize that the American government is after him, but then quickly gets recruited by the Czechoslovakian secret police who use him to try to get information from the Americans. And so he has two Secret Service agencies behind him. But of course, as I write, information, trust runs in deficit in these scenarios. And so the secret police in Prague actually has somebody tailing Morton Nadler himself because they don't trust that he might not be a double agent. But eventually, the reason that it connects the story of India is that Morton Nadler realizes that he's caught between a rock and a hard place. He can't go back to America because they think he's a defector. The Czechoslovakian government also doesn't trust him because they think that he might reveal secrets of their program, their secret radar programs to the United States. And so someone tells him that you need to go to a non-aligned country. And he looks around and he makes friends with a sort of, a low-level bureaucrat in the Indian embassy. And it just so happens that year, the professor, Mahalanobis, is visiting Prague, and Mahalanobis engineers his sort of escape from Prague to come to Calcutta to work on India's first computers. But the story of the India's first computers is that, as you said, Mahalanobis is quite a visionary because from the late 1940s onwards, he hears of computers being developed in Britain and in America. And though they're being used for explicitly military purposes in both these countries, he realizes that they will be crucial for running input-output tables and that they will be crucial for any kind of data crunching that independent India would need to have to do with the National Sample Survey and with planning. And so he travels in the late 1940s to Harvard, where he meets Howard Aiken, one of the pioneers of computers. He goes to Princeton, where he meets with John von Neumann and with Albert Einstein, trying to discuss with them the possibility of developing a computer in India or importing one. Eventually, the first digital computer that comes to India is from Britain, and its cost is a shocking $200,000. And that is one of the cheapest computers on the market. Some of the American computers cost $1 million, just one computer. And we have to remember that these computers probably had less computing power than the smartphones in our pockets at the moment, right? Which you can buy for for maybe $100 today, but cost up to $1 million at the time. And this is a time in which foreign exchange is really, really precious commodity to independent India. So I trace the story of how he brings that first computer to India. Another computer comes to India through the Soviet Union through a chance encounter at a lunch thrown by the prime minister, where Mahalanobis finds a way to sit next to the Soviet ambassador, Mikhail Menshikov. And he kind of lies to the Soviet ambassador saying, can you, give us a computer? And when Mikhail Menshikov hems and haws, he says, well, the Americans seem to be open to doing so. And since we're a socialist country, you are a communist country, what would be your objection to sharing a computer if the capitalist country doesn't have an objection? And Mikhail Menshikov basically says, send us an official letter. Mahalanobis rushes to the prime minister's office that evening, gets the letter. Next day morning, he's at Palam airport and hand delivers this letter to the Soviet delegation returning to Moscow. But an interesting episode also is the fact that actually India does not get one of the computers India is after, which is called the UNIVAC, because not just is it a very expensive computer, Mahalanobis for years is after this computer, but isn't able to understand why the Americans aren't willing to part with one of these computers for India. And he thinks it's just bureaucratic red tape. But what I found in files that were sort of labeled secret and confidential that have now been declassified is that in the American back channels between the American embassy in Delhi and the State Department of Washington, D.C., there is a very strong view that Mahalanobis is a communist, that the ISI, the Indian Statistical Institute, is a beachhead for the Soviet Union in India, and that therefore America should be doing nothing to help the spread of communism in India. And that this view of Mahalanobis as a communist threat, unbeknownst to the person leading the charge for India to get a computer, was one of the major reasons why India could not get an American computer for many years.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Nikhil, you mentioned early on in your in this conversation about democratic planning, and sometimes it's looked as an empty slogan, but in a way it's central to the vision of the times, Nehru's vision. There's a bit of a contradiction here as well, because economic planning is a technocratic exercise, plus your political system is based on universal franchise. So there's a bridge to be crossed there. You come up with a really interesting set of observations, of analysis about how the gap between technocratic planning and an emerging democracy actually was bridged. Could you speak a bit about that? And it's interesting that, for example, like you talked about communism, about modernization, etc. But besides sort of trying to spread the planning idea through cinema or literature, it's also like a contact with people, and Hindu holy men through the Bharat Sadhu Samaj also chipped in, right? Thanks to Gulzari Lal Nanda. So why was this done? Why was this entire attempt to take the planning idea to the people even thought of?
Yeah, I think that this was something that, again, I spent a lot of time thinking about, because it seemed to me like quite contradictory, right? As you suggest, right? That planning is eventually a technocratic enterprise. That is why people like Mahalanobis are so important to it. But then when I was also researching planning in the 1950s and 60s, I kept coming across these references to all kinds of myriad ways in which the Indian government is trying to reach out to the people, this rhetoric that is shared by many members of the Congress Party about democratic planning. And while you might think that is propaganda, and to some extent it is propaganda, I think it was worth for me to explore and dig into why is it that this is the kind of propaganda that is being employed. And for certain members or more idealistic members of the Congress Party, such as Nehru, there certainly seemed to be a sort of emotional investment and an intellectual investment in this idea of democratic planning. So the idea of democratic planning, as I said before, was that Indian planning is different from communist planning. It is a mixture of idealism about this new democracy and about how this democracy really comes into substance only when there's popular participation in it. But I think another aspect of democratic planning, and the reason that the Indian state is reaching out to its citizens to participate in the plan, is that there is a realism about limited state capacity. India realizes that the state capacity that it has is such that unless people make unbidden sort of voluntary contributions towards the plan, save in the way that the Indian state wants to, save in the kinds of bonds that it wants to, help with village projects of road building, dispensary building, all kinds of other things, that the plans really couldn't succeed. And so it's a combination of this idealism about democracy and what it meant to be a young democracy with participation from citizens, but also a cold-headed realization, realization about the realism about state capacity as well. And so the government went to extraordinary lengths to publicize the plans. So we have in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, publicity officers from the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting traveling on bullock carts, on jeeps, on boats, carrying publicity materials. And these are not one-off exercises. These are publicity officers who had a beat through several villages every month. They had to, in order to get their salary, be traveling 15 days a month, carrying publicity materials, carrying film projectors, to propagate ideas about the Panchvarsha Yojana, or the 5-year plan. There was a separate song and drama division in which the government of India employed singing troops and dramatic troops that would perform plays and musicals about Indian culture that would be melded with the themes of the 5-year plans. There were across India university planning forums. There were planning forums in colleges, there were planning forums at universities, and these were basically places where India's sort of emerging intelligentsia, the India's students, could debate aspects of the 5-year plans. And in theory, the idealistic vision was that those ideas would get sort of filtered up to the Planning Commission. Of course, none of that ever took place. There was a Khushwant Singh edited magazine called Yojana, which still exists. Today, of course, Yojana is used mostly by IAS aspirants, but at a time it was meant to be a way by which to reach out to ordinary citizens who might want to know what's happening in the development of the country. And as I pointed out, and as you mentioned, perhaps most intriguingly, the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which was established in 1956 and was this quite extraordinary idea of trying to put together planning, which is this very technocratic enterprise, with sadhus as the spokespeople of it. Sadhus who, Hindu ascetics who've actually given up on material life to engage in the propagation of a very materialistic enterprise, the 5-year plans. And the idea was that Gulzarilal Nanda, who was then the home minister, who was then the planning minister, then became home minister of India, and was actually 2-time interim prime minister of India as well. He believed that if the 5-year plans needed to become successful and popular, that they needed to be conveyed in the idioms that were most popular amongst people, and that is of religion. And so you have these quite amazing episodes in which sadhus are being instructed to combine the message of the Dvitiya Panchvarsha Yojana with that of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And so I also explore the idea of, what does this do to the much vaunted Nehruvian secularism when you have Hindu ascetics propagating these ideas? Because, of course, this comes back to sort of blow up in the face of the Congress government, because the Sadhu Samaj that was patronized by the Congress party eventually starts to champion causes such as banning cow slaughter and eventually even the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, and becomes an ally eventually of the VHP and the BJP by the 1990s.
Yeah, Nikhil, but just to push back a bit on this, and this is absolutely that part of the book, I think nobody has written about it as far as I know, and it throws an entire new light on planning and also on the politics of the day. But weren't similar things done by dictatorships as well? Like if you read the history of Eastern Europe in the 50s or even China in the 60s, this idea of people's brigades, of voluntarism, isn't this a strange paradox of planning in many countries where, you have a bunch of technocrats laying out a plan, as Friedman, as you cited, said that you can't move people like chess pieces, but they're trying to do it, and then trying to get some sort of popular, support for it, either through the democratic process or through even in non-democracies.
Yeah, I'd say that, yes, there are certainly parallels with all kinds of centralized governments that want to have their policies become effective. If you want to call them propagandists in India, are using, right? They're actually emphasizing the democratic aspect of it. And so I was interested in why is it that they're emphasizing the democratic aspect of it? And that unlike in the in the dictatorships of Eastern Europe or of the Soviet Union, in India, really, the government only has the carrot. India does not have the stick, right? I mean, like, for example, in the Chinese sort of re-education, brigades of the Cultural Revolution, or in the Soviet, mass education programs, etc., there is very much a stick that is involved as well, and there's a definite threat of state retaliation. Whereas here, it's only carrot that the state is able to engage in, and I think that that to me was an interesting aspect of it. And I think that while it still is accurate to say that this is state propaganda, I think that the particularities and the specificities of that propaganda is still worth engaging in to see what that says about the nature of the Indian state at that point. So, for example, how is it that this state that is emphasizing secularism so much and a sort of distance from religion is able to contort itself into employing the Bharat Sadhu Samaj? So those are the aspects that I was interested in, but I completely take the parallel.
I got it. Thanks for the clarification. I think it sort of settles that issue in my head, at least. Nikhil, if I may just move to a very broad question that, you've written this book, and as I said, it's like, I really took away a lot of insights from it, and it's beautifully written. But eventually Indian planning didn't work out, right? And it's just not the 91 moment. I think by the 70s, I think, it was obvious that it was a failed enterprise. Why do you think Indian planning failed in the long run?
I think that I should, in humility, preface my answer by saying that I am not an economist. I'm not trained in economics, and that people like you perhaps have more training in the sort of in the details of how plans might have run aground. But based on what I've researched, I'd say that it's useful to define planning and to define which phase of independent Indian history we're speaking of. So, as you suggested in your question itself, the answers would be quite different regarding success or failure for the 1950s versus, say, the 1970s and 80s. So, to first sort of define planning, I think that we need to distinguish between planning and import substitution policies that are usually just sort of conflated. So planning was popular in many parts of the world from the 1940s onwards, and popular in many parts of the world that actually we look to as success stories. So South Korea had planning, Japan had planning, China had planning, Malaysia, Vietnam had planning, and some countries outside, such as Ghana and Sudan, Argentina, had planning. And of course, the Soviet Union also had planning. But planning is just a technique, and the specific policies within it can be very different. So the kind of planning that South Korea engaged in, which was export-led, similarly with Japan and China as well, was very different from the kind of planning that India engaged in, which was import substitution. And this isn't my argument. I mean, scholars like Vivek Chibber and the political scientist Atul Kohli have argued that the problem might not necessarily have been planning as much as the policies adopted under the umbrella of planning, and that perhaps the problem was more import substitution rather than an export orientation. And we should note that the import substitution was actually something that Indian industrialists in the 40s and 50s were quite happy for, because it protected them from much more competitive forces abroad. So I think that is one aspect that is important to think about. And I think that, my book does engage with the idea of why is it that India chose this closed economy, this autarkic model and import substitution rather than an export-led economy. That's something that I do engage with in the book. And in terms of how it performed, I'd say that there seems to be some agreement based on the data that between around 1900 and 1950, the Indian economy grew at less than 1%. But from 1950 to the mid-1960s, it grew at around 4%, which is a sizable increase in rates of growth. So as even some critics of Nehruvian planning like Bibek Debroy have pointed out, that the Nehruvian phase was actually perhaps quite crucial in spurring growth, in building industrial capacity, etc. And that the license permit Raj really takes hold from, say, the late 1960s, but definitely from the 1970s onwards. And so I would leave it up to economists to come up with a detailed explanation for why the Indian economy begins to stall, from the second five-year plan's foreign exchange problems to the planned holidays in the late 1960s. But I think that crucial elements or ingredients of that answer would have to look at the licensing and red tape from 1970s onwards, combined with the inability to move towards an export orientation, even once those critiques had become mainstream by people like Manmohan Singh, by people like Jagdish Bhagwati, onwards from the 1960s and 70s onwards.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think 1950 to 1965 was definitely a structural break for the Indian economy, from, compared to the last decades of colonialism. And I think while obviously the internal problems of the plans were important, I would assume that after in the 1960s and early 70s, just a number of exogenous shocks, 3 wars, 3 or 4 droughts, a big oil shock. I think even many of those sent the Indian economy off the rails.
Absolutely.
Nikhil, one last question, and for that, let's circle back to the protagonist of your story, which is Mahalanobis. Now, as you said right in the beginning, that Mahalanobis was obviously the towering intellectual influence he had on Indian planning, but also on the Indian statistical system. And while I think it's safe to say that the Indian planning didn't work out perhaps as well as he would have liked, I think the Indian statistical system is really an enduring legacy of his. But of late, we've seen a significant weakening of that statistical system over the past 20 years or so. So any thoughts on some of these ongoing debates about strengthening in a way, the house that Mahalanobis built?
Yes, I think that, just a few weeks ago, The Economist carried a piece that described India's statistical system as crumbling. And this is a subject that, data journalists like Pramit Bhattacharya have pointed out, that there are some serious issues and that there are some long-term issues that date back to at least a couple of decades regarding this. But I think that there also seems to be a recognition amongst data journalists, but also amongst professional economists and statisticians that there is an acceleration in the decline of quality more recently. Over the last 5 years, we've discovered that, as I write in the book, that good data is not always good politics. And so we've seen the National Sample Survey results from the 2017-2018 surveys suppressed. We've seen certain other studies discontinued. And when the findings have been leaked, it's become clear that this is because the surveys showed record unemployment right before a general election or declines in household spending. And as a result, we don't really have a firm baseline for assessing levels of Indian poverty and unemployment. And this is something that the economist Martin Rebellion has pointed to, that India really, regardless of what the government states, it's not to say that the government is necessarily wrong, but we don't have any independent way of verifying it without having some clarity on this data, without the government releasing these data or reinstituting these surveys. And so these criticisms are, I'm basing my opinion based on criticisms that have come from professional economists and statisticians. And these are, economists and statisticians that, at least on economic policy, definitely do not see eye to eye. I mean, these are economists that range from JNU to MIT. These are economists that range from Jean Drèze to Arvind Subramaniam to Raghuram Rajan to Kaushik Basu to Abhijit Banerjee and Abhijit Sen. I mean, these are not people who, on economic policy definitely do not agree with each other. But on this criticism, they seem to see eye to eye on. And outside India, we have, Nobel Prize-winning economists Angus Deaton, Esther Duflo, and Thomas Piketty have all sort of pointed to this. And so I think that the chorus of opinion, of informed opinion on this seems to suggest that Indian data is going through a crisis, and that the fact that it's coming to be reported in foreign publications such as The Economist suggests that this is a problem not just for assessing things like growth rates, but also to do with COVID mortality. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why, regardless of which government is in power, having accurate, verifiable, robust data is crucial for a government to make economic policy. Even if this government does not believe in centralized planning, which I don't think any major, certainly none of the major national parties believe in today, you still need accurate and robust data to be able to make effective policy. And I think that is a real shame, especially given the quite proud legacy that we have in this regard.
Thanks, Nikhil. And It was just wonderful talking to you. Thanks for taking time off to speak on your book and some other more contemporary issues. I hope you've had a good time talking to us as well.
No, absolutely. Niranjan, thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you read my book, that you took the time to review it, and that you've taken the time to have this conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and it really is a pleasure to have such an informed and thoughtful reader.
Thanks, Nikhil.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.